In this presentation, I would like to discuss the concept of programmed filling developed by Dr. Randy Galuza, which I'll more fully explain later on, but first I want to lay some groundwork here. So programmed filling and speciation. Start with Job. But now ask the beasts, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. So God is speaking to Job here, and he is saying that what is created in nature will explain that he is the creator and the source of what we see. First concept I want to talk about is that species are not the same as biblical kind. We must always start with Scripture when dealing with any topic, but also with science, because this gives us the proper foundation to interpret the science in a historical framework, which we can count on to be constant and true. So looking in Genesis 1:25, and God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, and cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So here we have three repetitions of this concept of kind. So this would be, for example, the horse kind, and you see here the 8 species in the horse kind. And to show they're indeed one kind, there can be crossbreeding among the various species in the horse kind to obtain these critters such as zebrilla, zonkey, or zorse. And of course, many of you already know about the mule. Or the bear kind, there are also 8 species in the bear kind as well. And in Canada, out in nature, polar bear and grizzly bear had interbred, and had produced this offspring, which was a mixture, but unfortunately the hunter did not recognize this until after the bear was shot. And then we have, in the dog kind, we have interbreeding with the coyotes and wild dogs and wolves, and that is now termed the coy wolf, and there are millions of them around the landscape in the United States. So I want to turn to some crucial history in Scripture, starting in Genesis chapter 6, of the birds after their kind, and animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. So here again is this reinforcement of this concept of kind as opposed to species. And so then the question is, did every species need to be on the ark? And the answer is no, not at all. And in verse 19, and of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. So whether it be 2 of the bear kind, 2 of the parrot kind, 2 of the horse kind, the cat kind, raccoon kind, or the dog kind, and all the other kinds that were on the ark was all that was necessary, not the individual species. And God would have selected, because remember he brought the animals to Noah, that he would have selected the animals that had the full range of genes that he knew would be needed for them to deal with the changes in the climate, real climate change after the flood. And indeed, here we come to the flood here with this painting by Izazovsky, a Russian painter of the 1800s. And we see here a representation of flood and people dying with ships drowning. And so the flood purpose was to judge the sin of the world because of the terrible degree of sinfulness that occurred. And so that's why God caused the worldwide flood to occur. But then after we talk about that, we have in chapter 8, every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth, according to their families, went out of the ark. So we're again talking about kinds, and possibly maybe there were some offspring that came out as well as the parents of each kind. Here is a Belgian tapestry from the 1500s showing in the foreground the cat kind, dog kind, and in the background the horse kind, as well as the people and other types of birds, documenting in that view 2 of every kind coming off the ark. And then in chapter 9 of Genesis, it says, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And this verb fill is critical in our understanding of what God did with the genes, as we'll come to that later on. So the people did not obey the command Even though God gave it twice in chapter 9, they stayed at Babel and built a tower and worshiped the creation rather than the Creator. And then God had to judge them subsequently in chapter 11 and cause them to split apart because they could not understand each other's language. But the animals obeyed right away. And so here we have the representatives of the dog kind coming off the ark, multiplying and multiplying, and so on and so on and so on. Lots of dogs. And then finally we get to where there's many of them and they're able to spread apart and start going around to fill the earth. And so through sexual reproduction, you see here the representation of dominant and recessive genes with the capital and lowercase letters here, showing that just by sexual reproduction there is shuffling of the genes, and therefore various traits show up in the different groups of animals as they migrated and became isolated from each other. And so that's one of the mechanisms for the development of species after the flood. And you see here changes from wolf going to coyote to dingo and to collie, and then so on. I have here a quotation from secular scientist Dr. Robert Wayne at UCLA. Dogs seem to share more genetic similarity with Middle Eastern gray wolves than any other wolf population worldwide. The evolutionary biologist and senior author of the paper. Genome-wide analysis now directly suggests a Middle East origin for modern dogs. We have found that a dominant proportion of modern dogs' ancestry derives from Middle Eastern wolves. And this finding is consistent with the hypothesis that dogs originated in the Middle East. And so it's interesting to see here that this does indeed confirm the biblical historical account in Genesis. And then he goes on to say, this is the same area where domestic cats and many of our livestock originated and where agriculture first developed. So again, we see here that this finding from secular sources using genetics confirms what Scripture tells us in the history in Genesis. I'd like now to turn back to this concept of species not being the same as biblical kind and complete this thought. Another quotation from a secular source, Science, a journal, scientific journal, which very much promotes evolution. The origin of the domestic dog from wolves has been established. We examined the mitochondrial DNA sequence, variation among 654 domestic dogs, representing all major dog populations worldwide, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. What he's talking about here with mitochondrial DNA is that almost all of our DNA is in the nucleus of each cell, but we have these small organelles distributed throughout the rest of the cell. And one of those types of organelles is called a mitochondria, and this is where the fuel from the sugar and other molecules is processed to make what's called ATP, which is called the coin of energy for all of the, almost all of the molecular reactions that need energy to take place. And so what's unique about this mitochondrial DNA is instead of being double-stranded, it's just a single strand. Instead of being linear, it is circular. It only has 37 genes. It's quite small. It does not have the machinery for correcting mutations that the nuclear DNA has. And so it is more liable to have mutations occur without the ability to correct them. So the other thing about mitochondrial DNA is that it is only inherited from the females. So all DNA, all mitochondrial DNA, whether in the father or the mother, comes always from the mother. So this can be used to trace multiple generations, whether it be in animals or in families, and see the changes that take place in the mitochondrial DNA, and then be able to make some assessment about mutation rates and the origins of various groups to see if they have a common ancestor group or not. So here we see the gray wolf from which dogs have been speciated. And so the gray wolves were on the ark. It's been established by secular genetics. That's the source of all dogs. And so I thought it would be fun to take a look at various photos of the 34 species of the dogs and see some very interesting differences in their physical characteristics, whether it be, for example, the stripe on the bat-eared fox you see in the top left, or the extremely short legs on the bush dog you see in the middle on the right. And then the Arctic fox having white fur way up north. And then here we see some very interesting things with the humongous ears on the fennec fox from North Africa. And then the crab-eating fox is from the northern part of South America. And the dhoole is from India. So we see a wide range of characteristics here in these various species. Also, the Tibetan sand fox almost looks like it has a beard, kind of like me. And then the dingo is from Australia. And then we see here the domestic dog, which originally, before these genetic studies, had been considered to be a separate species from the gray wolf, but has now been lumped together. So now instead of 35 species in the dog kind, they now list 34 species. And then also you see here the Iberian wolf, and this looks like an extremely mean critter. I don't think I would like to be caught in a dark alley with one of those. And then you see here the red fox, which is the one that the English use for their fox hunting. Of interest especially is this raccoon dog, very short legs and this striped fur like this, most unusual. And then the extra long legs you see here of the maned wolf. So just to help you get a handle on this business of species and kind and how this all fits together, this is the taxonomic system first developed by Carl Linnaeus, or Carolinus Linnaeus, depending upon his Swedish name or Latin name. And this has been expanded since his time to add domain and various subgroups in these groupings, in these orders, these ranks. But a way to remember this, at least in the English language, is to ask the question, do king penguins congregate on frozen ground sometimes? And that follows for domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And the answer is, yes, they do. So this is a handy way to remember the order of these ranks. And so as we look at these in regard to the dog, we see eukaryote, which refers to cells that have distinct membranes around the nuclei and the organelles within each cell. And then Animalia, of course, animals, and Chordata having a spinal cord. And then Mammalia having the characteristics of being warm-blooded, having a four-chambered heart, fur, giving usually almost always live birth to young mammary glands, and so on. And then carnivora, meat eaters, and then Canidae, meaning the actual dog family. And so in the instance of the dogs here, the dog family coincides with the biblical kind. That's where the ranking would be. And then Canis, the actual dog genus, and then the species, including familiaris, meaning domestic dog. Let's have a little bit of fun with some of the names, scientific names, the Latin names of some of these few examples here. Otocyan megalotis means in Latin, ear, dog, big ear. And so you see here that that is very appropriate for the bat-eared fox. Another example is Ducicyan vetulus, which means the lead dog, old. So the old dog is the leader. And so you see here that it is frosted, as its common name, the hoary zoro, referring to its having this frosted characteristic on the hair with white on the ends of the hair. Another example then would be the vulpus vulpus, the red fox, the one for the fox hunts, and that means fox, fox. So that's the foxiest of the foxes. And then we have Canis lupus, which means dog, wolf, and indeed that's the gray wolf, so that's very appropriately named, as it turns out, since that's the progenitor of the dog kind off of the ark, as well as Canis latrans, which means dog barking. And any of you who have heard a coyote barking, indeed, it's a rather distinct sound, and especially when a pack of them gather together at night and bark in a group, it's really impressive how loud they can become. And then on one occasion, a coyote gave birth to 6 pups just outside of our home in the bank of a wash. And 3 of the pups came in, I captured 3 of them, and coming into our yard here, they were able to squeeze through the slats in the fence. And for about 3 weeks, we were able to enjoy them coming into the grassy area and playing around, chasing insects and having fun until they finally outgrew the openings and could no longer enter the yard. And then Canis familiaris, the domestic dog, then is what is we have greatest experience with. There are some 422 breeds within this species. And so I would like to turn now to the concept of artificial selection. And this is one thing that Darwin did correctly in his book on the origin of species. In the 15 chapters, the first chapter was about artificial selection, and he went on at great length and in detail about how the powers of observation and intelligence in the breeder had to be exquisite and exceedingly well developed, whether they were breeding pigeons, dogs, cats, cattle, or whatever other type of animal that was being observed and bred. And he got that part right, that the people who were making these close observations were then able to select the particular individuals that they wanted to breed to accentuate certain traits. And so through artificial selection, we end up with situations here where this bull mastiff is nearly the size of the horse through artificial selection, and also where the chihuahua is not much larger than a rat. And I like to think of these chihuahuas as overgrown rats. And so we also have the situation where you see the full-size horse there next to the people, but also this is an adult horse that has, its line has been bred for small stature. You know, this is not a colt or a newborn. So how does this happen, doggone it? It is breeding, it's artificial selection, and it's through intelligent input, through that careful observation and selection that Darwin spoke about at great length. So here I'd like to just give you an example with the symbol for the male on top and the symbol for the female on the side, and then using capital letters to represent dominant genes. And so that would be appropriate for the large skeletal size of the bull mastiff, and then lowercase letters for small skeletal size, the recessive genes, as would be the case for the chihuahua, the overgrown rat. And then in between would be a spectrum, a continuum of various combinations of the uppercase and lowercase letters, indicating this broad spectrum of in-between skeletal sizes from the bull mastiff to the chihuahua. And so the gray wolf would have had the genes for all of these expressions of, in this case, the trait of skeletal size, and also all the other traits, genes, so that the eventual speciation, those various animals would be able then to use portions of the information that is in the gray wolf. And so we see that the situation is that as speciation occurs, it is not through gain of information and added information. It is through loss of information, no new information added, and so that's how we see this downhill progression to the chihuahua. So that's the one thing that Darwin did get right. The other 14 chapters in this book were simply incorrect, especially according to the knowledge we have today in genetics. So I'd like to talk now about natural selection versus programmed filling, and here is the meat of the talk. In the biology book used where I teach at Arizona Christian University, Campbell Biology, it says, Darwin called this mechanism of evolutionary adaptation natural selection because the natural environment selects for the propagation of certain traits among naturally occurring variants in the population. Well, unfortunately, this is not true. This gives the power for deciding what happens to the environment, and then the animal or plant is the passive victim. And so it places the environment as being the active agent here. But as we'll see, this simply is not true. But this way of thinking in terms of the evolutionary scenario starts with this concept of overpopulation, that animals and plants can populate greatly in numbers, more than the environment can support. And so this leads to the survival of the fittest, and then power is attributed to the environment to determine who is the fittest, so that nature has been described as being red in tooth and claw by Sir Lord Alfred Tennyson, in his poem, Locksley Hall, A Prophecy. And then it's all about death, as we can see from these points here. And so I'd like to give you an example of how we look at things. We have the same evidence, but yet we have different worldviews, and those different worldviews determine how we interpret that same evidence. So I'm going to show you here a representation of a stegosaurus and a velociraptor, and I'm going to flip the velociraptor upside down, and you say, why in the world is he doing that? And that's to show you this fossil here that was found in China with the stegosaur on the left and the velociraptor on the right in an upside down position. And so if you have the worldview of an evolutionist and you have the assumption of survival of the fittest and struggle to the end, you would say that this was indeed a fight and that the velociraptor lost the fight, and that was the story. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that the forelimbs of the stegosaur are missing. And so if you think in terms of the biblical model in creation, you would say, you know what? I bet that these two animals were washed together by the flood into this position. The forelimbs of the stegosaur were ripped away as part of the flood process, and they ended up together in this position, then buried and subsequently mineralized. So in catastrophic burial. I do have here, though, an example of natural selection in action here. Of course, this is a silly construction here, but it makes the point that if these lions wanted to eat these animals, they would have, and dead things don't evolve. So natural selection does not occur by survival of the fittest in that sense. Instead, I would like to talk about programmed filling mission to go where no dog has ever gone before, if you've watched the Star Trek movies. The definition of programmed filling: active organisms continuously sense, track, and self-adjust to essentially passive conditions external to them. The organism's basic and adaptable forms, from physiologic to multi-generational changes, are 100% internally derived. So this means instead of the environment being the active agent and the animal the passive victim, it's the other way around. The environment is passive, and the animal and plant actively respond to changes in the environment and deal with it through genetic changes, which we're going to talk about. Again, I just want to mention that Dr. Randy Galuza is the doctor who put these things together, taking already established bits of information from genetics and put this together. So programmed filling is adaptation to the external changes for different time spans. We have the immediate, rapid change over seconds or minutes. We have short-term change over days or weeks, and then long-term change over generations. And an example I'd like to give of immediate adaptation is when we have the stimulus to decrease body temperature. We've changed from being in a comfortable place to where it's very cold, and so we have to respond to that. And so first of all, we have the sensory nerves to detect the changes, which then send that information to the brain, and then this processes it, and then sends information to the blood vessels to constrict in our extremities to conserve heat, and also sends messages to the muscles to have purposefully uncoordinated contractions so that these muscle contractions can burn fuel and generate heat. We call this shivering. And it's shivering rather than having full range of motion contractions, so we don't end up pounding ourselves. And then in addition, nerve signals are sent to the tiny little smooth muscles around the base of the hairs and our skin, which then tell the hair to stand up and to trap air, creating a layer of air as insulation. So these three response mechanisms we have in order to rapidly adapt to changes in decrease in temperature. And then the responses noted in the brain, and then further adjustments are made, either to do more of this or to back off if temperature has increased enough to be comfortable. Also, there's a fourth mechanism, and that is change in our behavior, such as putting on a coat or leaving a cold cave and stepping out to where it's warm and outside. So this all has to be programmed information. All of these things that happen have to be built into the DNA for the various structures to exist and for them to behave the way they do. Another example is when we have the flight or fright experience where someone appears before us and it's a very dangerous situation. Maybe they're wielding a knife or a gun, or we're about ready to have a real serious automobile accident. We can see that it's going to occur and is unavoidable. And so we have these various changes that go on, including increasing blood flow to the brain, getting more oxygen and fuel to the brain. Our pupils dilate for sharper, more wide vision. Also, we have the heart rate increasing to be able to pump more blood to the body to where it's needed. Our lungs open up, we breathe more deeply, more rapidly. Oxygenation increases, diffusion of the gases. The intestinal and circulation is shut down, so when we're in a flight or fright situation, we need not to worry about digesting food, but instead get the blood going to the muscles and the brain and heart and lungs, so that so much digestion is not occurring. We also have the situation where all of this is together, it's coordinated, it's in response to the brain perceiving the danger through our senses and then processing that and then sending a signal down to the adrenal gland so that epinephrine, or adrenaline as it's also known, will be secreted into the bloodstream and then cause all these other changes that we talked about. So this is another immediate example of reacting to the environment. We are not the passive victim, we are actively responding and changing to be able to deal with this situation. In terms of an example of short-term adaptation, when we are exposed to high altitude, we have increase in blood flow for the brain to maximize oxygen delivery to the brain, increased metabolism in the brain cells to be able to maximize the fuel that is provided and the oxygen that is provided. The lung has better capacity to have gases diffused to get the CO2 out and to breathe in the oxygen and get it into the circulation. There is nitric oxide, which is produced as the byproduct of certain metabolic reactions, and this is one atom of nitrogen, one of oxygen that combine to make the molecule. That's not the word no, it's the molecule, and this molecule causes the muscles around the blood vessels in the lungs to relax, to open up, to have better blood flow through the lungs. The heart better takes up the sugar, the glucose for fuel, so it can pump in this situation where it needs to pump harder and faster. So we have a faster heart rate to pump blood to the body. The hemoglobin concentration is increased over about a 3-day period. So the bone marrow responds to the signals that we don't have as much oxygen in our body as we should have through hormone communication. And so we make more hemoglobin to have better oxygen capturing and carrying capacity, and an increase blood flow through the extremities to be able to work better, the tissues to get better oxygenation. And the capillary density, that's where the oxygen and the fuel are actually delivered to the cells. That capillary density increases to better fuel the tissues in the body. And then the mitochondria are those little organelles inside the cells that convert sugar into glucose, and so that density of them decreases so that there can be a maximum efficiency in using the fuel and oxygen that is available to the body. So I'd like to now show you long-term adaptations to programmed filling, and this would be multi-generational ones where we have the example of the gray wolf then speciating into these 33 other species, and that species with the gray wolf does include the domestic dog as well. And so we have the first mechanism is programmed filling by sexual reproduction, which I mentioned earlier, and here's a Belgian tapestry from the 1500s showing the pairs of the animals coming off the ark as well as the people. And so let's use the example of fur length here. And so, as I said earlier, that God chose animals that had the full range of genes that would be needed to deal with the post-flood situations resulting from real climate change, not the joke of climate change they talk about today. And the animals here have both genes for long and short fur. This is a simplified representation, but it's to get the idea across. And so that 25% of the offspring will have only the genes for short fur. They've lost the genes for long fur. And 50% will have both long and short genes, and 25% will have only the genes for long fur. They've lost the information for short fur. So if you mate two animals that have only the genes for long fur, their offspring can only have long fur. And so it's not possible for them to have short fur unless they are bred with other individuals that do have short fur and reintroduce that information into that small population. And so using the Punnett squares, the symbol for the male and the symbol for the female, using capital letters for the dominant gene, meaning for dark colored fur in this case, and the small case letters, lowercase letters for the recessive gene, meaning for white fur, lack of pigment, and the intermediate range in between with the various combinations of the recessive and dominant genes giving a broad range of colors available. So that if an individual has only the genes for long fur and for white fur, then it will be perfectly suited for the Arctic climate, such as in this Arctic fox. So that first mechanism of the 5 mechanisms for programmed filling, for God putting the information into the genome at creation to be used later on when needed, is what we've discussed. Now the second example is hybridization, taking 2 different species and recombining them and having the information from both of them put together with one of them supplying information that may not be in the other. And so, as I mentioned with the coy wolf, where dogs, wolves, and coyotes interbreed, we have millions of these in the American landscape now. So the 2 that you are already familiar with, 2 mechanisms, are sexual reproduction and hybridization. Now let's talk about 3 that will most likely not be known to you. One is internally directed changes in the DNA. That means purposeful changes that are directed for a real specific reason in the DNA, changes in the DNA. And then program filling by internally directed changes on the DNA. By that we mean involving the proteins that are so closely associated with the DNA. And then also finally changes in the microbiome, which is, the microbiome is the sum total of the microscopic organisms that live in and on us, such as on our skin, in our upper respiratory tract, our throat and mouth, in our gut. So we have these organisms. And for a person of my size, approximately 6 pounds of my total body weight is made up by microorganisms. But I want to talk now about this concept about being the active responder rather than the passive victim to changes in the environment. And so this ship is given the job to deal with situations that come about through change, and it's given the job to protect itself and to protect the coast. And so in biology, we have been teaching that the protein machines in the membrane that surrounds each cell, that these are receptors, passive receptors. And in a sense they are, but the whole system is not passive at all. It's a very active response. So I just wanted to emphasize this business of receptor proteins in the membrane that respond to the red sphere representing the molecule that's coming and causing a response in the cell membrane, which is then relayed onto other mechanisms inside the cell. Well, I bring that up to say that here we have this incoming signal. So here is a stimulus, and this incoming signal, as you can see, is very dangerous, as in it would cause the ship to blow up. So in this situation, do you want a receptor or do you want a detector? And I think it's obvious that you really want a detector so that you can respond and defend yourself and adapt to the new conditions that you are encountering. So therefore, I have changed this to detector tyrosine kinase protein, just to make the point that it's not just a passive situation in the entire system. And so then in response to the molecules that stimulate these two proteins, they come together and form one unit called a dimer, meaning two-segment unit. And then that causes a cascade of things to happen with energy being expended. I mentioned that ATP is the molecule that's called the coin of energy that's expended in order to make molecular reactions occur inside our cells. And so 6 molecules of ATP are expended, and then as the phosphate groups are then added to this protein, that stimulates other proteins to change, and this whole cascade of things occur involving events inside the nucleus itself, with triggering things to happen with DNA for proteins to be made or to not be made, as well as triggering other events in the part of the cell outside of the nucleus. So this is programmed filling by changes in the DNA, and we call this jumping genes as a nickname. The proper technical word is transposon, or transposons plural, and that literally means put across or placed across. These are genes that move from one location in the DNA to a different location. And initially, evolutionary thinking was that these were just random chances. That's why they were called jumping genes, jumping from one spot to another with no rhyme or reason or purpose. But we now know that this is not the case at all, that these are very purposefully directed to specific sites where the change in location of these genes regulate other genes to turn them on or turn them off. And so this is directed changes in the DNA to use the programming that was given at creation to make the changes to fill new niches in the ecology, to fill locations that are different than what the organism encountered before, so that they can spread out and fill the earth. All right, so a specific example of this change in the DNA can result in this mottling of the fur in the African wild dog, so that it can have the camouflage it needs to have better protection in that environment. Whereas if this particular species were in the Arctic, it would not do well at all, because its fur is mottled and dark instead of pure white, and it's also much shorter. Very interesting experiment was done in Soviet Russia in the 1950s through the 80s. Dmitry Belayev did a experiment in Novosibirsk in Siberia in Russia, and he was working with a silver fox. And the reason they were working with these was because they were used to make these beautiful coats. So they had these fox farms specifically for the production of these coats. And so animals were chosen that were observed to be more tameable. They were not selected for any other trait whatsoever. And by the 6th generation, these silver foxes were seeking human contact and acting just like domestic dogs. And so you see here the transition from the initial behavior of these foxes, which have been going on, forever, where they're very vicious, nasty, biting, clawing, attacking, to wanting to be held like any domestic dog and to lick the face and to be very cuddly. And again, I want to stress that these were simply animals that were selected for their tameability, not for any other reason. But very fascinating things happened as well. that along with the tameability increasing, also these other changes occurred in which the tails were curling up now instead of being straight, and that the facial bones widened and they developed the floppy ears instead of the upright pointed ears that you would see in the wild foxes. And changes in the color of the mask of the face, they whitened as long as maybe spots further down on the neck and chest. So there was coat depigmentation in certain portions of their body. And all of this was going on because of these changes on the DNA. So there were changes in the DNA with the transposons, the jumping genes. Now we're talking about changes on the DNA involving the proteins around which the DNA is wrapped to keep it in order so it's not tangled and can be tightly wound or loosely wound around the proteins to be turned on or turned off, whether or not there's access to the DNA by the proteins that are used for creating messenger RNA and subsequent protein production. So there you see the diagram of these blue protein spheres, which are called histones, and those are what are used to keep the DNA orderly and untangled and to regulate whether it's accessible or not accessible. And so the ways to alter this condition of how tightly wound the DNA is around these histone proteins is to use these other three chemical groups. And here you see a molecule of methane. It's a gas that we know is produced by cows and humans, and we use to burn in natural gas. And if you take off one hydrogen, that methyl group now is able then to combine with the tail of these histones, these protein tails, and then cause the winding of the DNA around the histones to become tighter and therefore make the DNA inaccessible. Also changes are made here, represented by these orange figures here with these acetyl groups, that if this acetyl group is added onto the histones, it causes the DNA to loosen and become more accessible and can then have protein production go forward. And the same is true with phosphate groups as well, causing more accessibility. So with these program changes on the DNA involving these histone proteins, there are multi-generational changes that occur. And so we have the pregnant dog here that is exposed to vinegar. I mentioned the acetyl group in the previous slide. Well, the acetyl group is acetic acid is what vinegar is, about a 3% solution of acetic acid. And so they're exposed, the mothers are exposed to the smell of the vinegar repeatedly, and the offspring, the pups, have a much heightened sense of smell, of ability to smell the vinegar. And their smell signal processing is heightened and the number of smell receptors is increased. So that these offspring are excellent for being able to smell vinegar, acetic acid. Well, why do we care about that? Well, it's because acetic acid is used to process opium into heroin by illegal drug traders, and they don't, purify their product like the FDA would have legitimate companies do, and so that residual smell of the acetic acid, the vinegar, is detectable by the dogs to a very exquisite degree, and so that's how they can sniff out the drugs and then catch the bad guys. Okay, the last mechanism is the programmed filling by directed changes in the microbiome. And keep noticing that I keep saying directed changes, not random chance changes. So these directed changes in the microbiome, the sum total of all the microorganisms on and in our bodies, represented here by bacteria in the gut, is noted to be changed under different conditions. We have many good types of bacteria that we need in our gut. They do things such as produce vitamin K for us, and we need the vitamin K to make the clotting factors in our liver so that our blood can clot properly when we receive a wound. Among many other things that the bacteria do for us, aside from helping digest our food as well. While talking about food, this dachshund is 50 pounds overweight. been fed too much and obviously wasn't able to move around much. So the microbiome of the dachshund here in question was analyzed, and they cultured out as many different species of bacteria and other microorganisms as they could, and then they put the dog on a diet with proper food reduction and type of food, as well as exercise when the dog was finally able to move around better. And this is the very same beast, not a different animal, and those 50 pounds were worked off, and this beast was then subjected to analysis of the microbiome again, and there were remarkably different changes in the bacterial and other microorganismal populations. So this shows that there are major changes in the microbiome in relationship to our status, our condition. So to underscore the concept of programmed filling, the God of the Bible designed the several mechanisms of genetic adaptation into the genome. The organisms detect change and alter the physiologic and genetic responses with the change that is detected, such as an immediate situation with the stress reaction we talked about, short-term adaptation to altitude, long-term multi-generational change in utero, so that the offspring can be better sensors of the smell for acetic acid, for example, in the drug dogs, and then over multi-generations leading to new speciation. So put these together, we see that the power is God's put into the genome for active response on the part of the organism. And so I want to contrast here for you the two different models. On the left, the evolutionary model, which says that from a very small gene pool, meaning from that first living organism, that first living cell, however it came into a being, which they have no way to explain, which increased due to mutations and selection. But the problem is mutations do not add information. There's not one single known mutation to add information anywhere. Mutations cause loss of information and death and disease. But they say mutations and selection, natural selection, changing from one kind into a totally different kind, which is not possible because there are limits to genetic change, which the secular geneticists also acknowledge, but at a loss to explain how there can be a mechanism genetically for evolution. By gain of information, but as I just said, there is no gain of information through mutation. So this is against the laws of genetics, against the laws of science. Evolutionary model is anti-science. On the other hand, and this is a house of cards that has fallen down, and it's just waiting for the general public to be able to recognize that as we become better educated. The creation model, on the other hand, shows that from a very large gene pool, as is given to us through those multiple examples of the created kinds in those early chapters of Genesis, which divides by migration and programmed filling. So migration after the flood, after 106 years after the flood, at the judgment of the Tower of Babel, forcing people to spread out to form different people groups, but also the animals immediately after the flood obeying God and spreading out and multiplying until changes occur within a kind. So that's how we see the development of the 34 species within the dog kind. By loss of or directed alteration to the genetic information. Loss of by sexual reproduction with shuffling of genes when the eggs and sperm are formed, and also by these mechanisms, other mechanisms that I've just discussed in the model of programmed filling. And the foundation for this is Scripture, which never changes, in contrast to the evolutionary model, which is constantly being changed as we learn more, trying to make itself still seem viable in light of the new information. So here is a man who is posing a question to Dr. Richard Dawkins, now Professor Emeritus at Oxford of Zoology. who is, I think, the most well-known and outspoken proponent of evolution in the English-speaking world, who is also very anti-Christian, anti-Bible, pro-evolution, pro-humanism. And so this question is posed to him is, Professor Dawkins, can you give just one example of a mutation or genetic alteration which adds to the information in the genome? And then you will see Richard Dawkins' answer.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
So you can tell that he has no answer. He cannot give an example, not even one word, in trying to give an example of a mutation that adds information to the genome. So now I'd like to address the question of why would speciation occur over a short time so rapidly? Well, in Genesis chapter 2, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground, but a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And so this is giving us a clue as to the conditions before the flood, that there was a mist, water was not recycled through the atmosphere, through the weather system we have today, but rather through subterranean water recycling, with springs bringing it back up, and then a mist arising to water the ground. And also we have this, that they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. And this is after they were given the command to multiply and fill the earth. So then it would be logical to assume that the climate of the whole earth was very comfortable for people without clothing, a subtropical climate probably, and that there would not have been very high mountains, because then it would have been too cold to not have clothing on to stay warm. And that it's likely that a greater percentage of the surface of the planet was terrestrial land rather than covered with water, as 75% of the planet is today. It's also thought that the pressure in the atmosphere of the air pressure was higher prior to the flood than it is today, with a lot more oxygen and carbon dioxide in it than today, because of the size of these fossils, of these flying reptiles that are equivalent to the size of a giraffe or even larger. And so it's felt that in order for them to be able to gain enough lift, that they had to have greater air pressure under those wings to be able to fly in the air. And you also see here the example of the dragonfly with the 3-foot wingspan as well. All of the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And so one conception is that this water came from the deep under extremely high pressure, doing a lot of eroding, causing the production of the silt and fine material which became sedimentary rock. And so there was a tremendous amount of material that was buried as a result of the flood process. And so we are confident that the entire surface of the planet was remodeled due to the violence of the flood process. And so you see here Noah and his family and the animals coming off of the ark after being on it for 53 weeks, according to the timelines given to us in Genesis. And that residual today, we still see residual volcanic and earthquake activity in the ring of fire around the rim of the Pacific as just a remnant of what was going on during the flood process. We know this because there are layers of sedimentary rock that are interlaced with layers of volcanic rock, lava, that were laid down during the time of the flood. And so we can know that there were underwater volcanoes, submarine volcanoes, that are part of the fountains of the great deep opening up, as mentioned in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. And so these volcanoes, this lava, these events coming from the crust, liberating a lot of heat, would warm up the forming oceans and then create a lot of water vapor in the air, in the atmosphere. Also, the volcanoes that remained above water level would spew a lot of ash into the atmosphere, And the combination of these water vapor clouds and the ash clouds blocking the sun would cause the continents to cool off while the oceans are quite warm. So with this combination of a tremendous amount of water evaporating into the atmosphere from the warm oceans and then blowing over the cooler land masses and then coming down in the form of snow would be the mechanism for the one and only ice age after the flood. And so we see here a diagram which it is estimated, it shows the estimation that as the clouds did block the light to a degree, and the snow was being laid down from the water vapor from the oceans, that there would be a peak of ice being formed at approximately 500 years. But at that time, the skies would have cleared significantly, the land warm up, and then the ice age mass of ice would start to decrease, having reached its peak at approximately 500 years after the flood. But while the ice age was in its full swing, and even as it was declining, there was a tremendous amount of water from the oceans locked up in ice and snow on the land, so that the level of the oceans, the sea level, was decreased from some 300 to 400 feet. And secular scientists and scientists or creationists agree on this. Nobody disagrees about the degree of lowering of the water level in the oceans, but of course the big dispute is about the time frame, how long ago this happened. And so you see here maps that show that with that much lower water level of the oceans, that the coastlines were greatly broadened, and that in this greenish color you see here that the Bering Straits become this huge, wide landmass, several hundred feet wide, as a huge bridge for which the people and the animals could migrate from the Middle East to the New World without any problem. And in other parts of the world, such as in the Caribbean here, that most of the islands then had these bridges to the continents for animals to get to them as well as people. And same with Southeast Asia and Australia. And then of course people using boats and taking animals with them, such as the Polynesians arriving in Hawaii, as has been documented and reenacted. So as a result of all of this, there ended up being real climate change with the very cold polar regions with the ice and snow, and the very warm, humid, hot regions of the equatorial zones. And then in between, two bands of desert with the dry areas due to the direction of the prevailing winds at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. And where I live in Phoenix, Arizona, we fall into that band at 32 degrees north and have quite a bit of desert to deal with. And so the development of all of these various ecologies after the Ice Age and the flood gave a wide range of new types of homes, a wide range of different ecological zones for the animals and plants to adapt to, using these 5 mechanisms that we have talked about, fulfilling God's command to fill the earth through the mechanisms of programmed filling provided in the DNA at creation. And so here we see that once again the gray wolf, the progenitor of all of the dog species in the dog kind. And so Job here says, "Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? And whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind?" And of course the answer is the God, Creator God of the Bible. Thank you very much.